This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
I've been coerced into watching tonight's movie.
You do have books in the 24th century.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. We haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett and today I'm back at the University of Greenwich with Dr. Chris Nunn. Hi Chris, how are you?
I'm good, thank you, and how are you?
I'm not too bad. And this time we're talking about a film. Last time we were podcasting together, we were talking about a film that I told you I couldn't even remember whether I saw it at the cinema or not. That's how kind of complex and ambivalent my relationship to that film was. This time, I can tell you, I remember vividly when I saw this film. This was, as you probably can as well. Yeah. We'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. We're talking about Star Trek Generations, which I know is a film that maybe has, for many fans, lost some of the sheen that it had when it was first released as that kind of big cinema release for the Next Generation crew. But for me, I think I'll never lose that sort of memory of what it was like going to the cinema. I went to see this film at the Empire Leicester Square, which was kind of the most exciting place you could go in London to see it. I'm convinced, now I don't know if this is my faulty memory or if this is something that really happened, that they had some kind of laser show before the film. Is that possible? Have I imagined this? Have you ever heard of people talking about this, that they did that at the Empire Leicester Square at one point?
As to the Empire Leicester Square, I can't comment because I saw the film at the Odeon and Brighton Marina. Right. Where there definitely wasn't a laser show.
No, probably not.
So I'm just trying to think if I've never heard or read anything about it. But
the weird thing is, if it didn't happen, there must be something about this film that made this impression on me, that in my mind it's been kind of this fake memory has been created of this futuristic sci-fi extravaganza that was going on in the theatre as everyone was kind of getting ready to watch this film, and also just the film itself, and particularly I suppose for a lot of people that crash scene was just jaw-dropping for me as a big Star Trek fan at the time going into the cinema. So I think I have quite a soft spot for this film, and this is something we can sort of talk about the merits and demerits of this film. But I'm not one of the people who thinks this is complete trash and the worst of the next gen films or whatever. I actually, I don't think it's too bad. I think it's a flawed film, but there's. I suppose what I felt watching it this week in preparation for this is it's a film that maybe is never quite more than the sum of its parts, but a lot of its parts are actually really good for my money anyway. Yeah,
I think you're absolutely right. I think it seems to get a bad rap, especially among kind of die-hard Star Trek fans, possibly many of whom are listening to this.
They should go and watch Die Hard instead.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, absolutely. go and have a good time. But I think the film has some really interesting elements and things that really reflect exactly what you want from Star Trek. Maybe it's an elongated episode. Maybe it just tries to go on too long. I absolutely appreciate that it manages to kill Kirk twice, and that possibly both of those deaths are a bit controversial. Maybe not that first one. I remember resonating quite a lot, and then of course in subsequent years I've heard Shatner joke, it wasn't Captain on the bridge, but it was Bridge on Captain.
And this was, to be fair, they actually killed Kirk 3 times. They went for the hat trick because they'd shot an original ending where Kirk was shot in the back didn't like it, went down badly with the test screenings, so they did this kind of weird bridge. For me, it's the way that he's almost like being crucified. He's sort of holding onto the bridge and flipping down, and then it actually happens. I mean, not that he dies because he's not quite dead, but it happens off screen, which again is slightly weird. I do think that whole... We could come on in a bit to talk about that ending. The fact that they reshot that ending, it was quite a stressful situation, going back, recreating at great expense this whole set that they built and then dismantled because the national park people were like, you have to take everything back. You're ruining our national park or whatever. I'm not quite sure that they got it right second time either. I think for a lot of fans, that's not the death that they wanted Captain Kirk to have. I can sort of see that. I mean, if you think about the way Spock dies, the way Data dies, the way other big deaths have been handled in Star Trek, there's not just the heroic decision to do something, which you do get here. There's the fact that they're kind of... Data blows up that ship in Nemesis, so they take things into their own hands somehow. Whereas with Kirk, it's literally like, yes, he's done the good thing, and then he's just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he's completely passive. He's literally just hanging onto that bridge, and it's going to kill him, and there's nothing he can do. So I can sort of see the argument that maybe he should have blown up the rocket. Do you know what I mean? He could have been the guy to go up to the rocket and manually blow it up with him on it, and then that would have been the kind of heroic self-sacrifice, whereas actually he never... Maybe that's what it is. Both Data and Spock sacrifice themselves knowingly, whereas Kirk just gets into this risky situation and it, for once, goes wrong.
Having said that, if we are pointing out that the movie actually kills Kirk, let's say twice in the way that it actually plays out, the first death is the noble self-sacrifice.
It is, yeah.
He knew that,
possibly.
Going into that place was the wrong thing to do, but it was the right thing to do because it would save the people on the Lakul, or save the Enterprise B.
And because he's seen the Wrath of Khan, so he knows the kind of symbolism of leaving the bridge. Because there's that great moment where Harriman is going to do it, and Kirk is sitting in the captain's chair, really smug and like, "Hey, I'm in the captain's chair. This is great." And then he just has that line from off screen, which I've always thought sounds weirdly dubbed. It almost doesn't sound like William Shatner, I think, because it doesn't sound like Kirk. It seems like such an un-Kirk thing to do somehow. But you're right. He's going down there. I don't know if he knows what's going to happen necessarily, but you're right. He's putting himself in the line of a fire, in a sense, in the line of danger, I suppose.
And to talk about the film from a production point of view, it is interesting. That scene and that sequence is interesting because it was never meant to be Chekhov, and it was never meant to be Scotty. It was meant to be Bones, and it was meant to be Spock.
Which explains why Chekhov is suddenly dealing with the medics.
Yes, right.
Which
exactly.
I always thought was a bit random.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's a few things that are inconsistent, that don't quite gel. Having said that, the first time I saw the film, much like yourself, I was young and along for the ride. Yeah.
In terms of that early section, and it's about, I think it's like about sort of 18 minutes, something like that, the first chunk of the film. It's a fairly hefty, it's not just a scene, it's not just like a cameo, for those characters. It is like a short film almost, that kind of death of Kirk at the beginning. I've always thought it works quite well. I think that James Doohan and Walter Koenig really sell it. And they sell, James Doohan particularly, that, when they come down and they see that kind of massive rip in the side of the ship, absolutely sells that kind of, the kind of tragic moment, if you know what I mean, through them, because, we don't see Kirk. Kirk is vanished. And then again, talking about this which I suppose is what I sort of want us to focus on a little bit today, is kind of how does this work as a TV porting into the cinema, if you know what I mean, because this is not the motion picture where we're going to reimagine Star Trek for the cinema. This is literally, 1 week we're filming All Good Things, the next week we're filming Generations, and literally they were filming those scenes on the Enterprise B while they were filming All Good Things next door, effectively. So they were overlapping these two things. But also you've got that sense, which you get again in some of the Star Trek films, you get it in First Contact, I guess, of suddenly this sense of the scale of the ship. And I think, again, that shot of the Enterprise B with that kind of gash ripped out of it where Kirk would have been, again, kind of sells that, and it sells it in a very cinematic way, because it does have that sense of scale, it does have that kind of sense of grandeur. that was one of the things that sort of impressed me about it, is that although they were running straight from the TV show into the movie, although they were largely using the same sets and just relighting them and you know, sort of sprucing them up a bit of new carpet, a bit of etc., I actually think they made a lot of effort to make this look cinematic. And I know they brought in an Oscar-nominated director of photography and so on. And I think it really shows. And I think if you watch All Good Things and then you watch this, as much as many people say, "Oh, All Good Things was a better story," they should, you know, that should have been the movie. Everyone loves All Good Things. There's no contest. This looks 10 times better. You know, just visually, musically, you know, all those kind of ways. This is like a massive cut above, I think.
But for what All Good Things had to do as well, which involved kind of time travel within the world of the TV show, and that is very specific because myself, our last podcast, we were able to watch it on the projector. We were able to watch Nemesis on the projector at my house. And so one of the things that always gets me watching stuff on the projector at my house is whether it's 4:3 or 16:9. Am I in television land, you know, 90s television land, or am I in kind of cinema land? And you know, All Good Things, every time I put on a Star Trek episode that haven't been remastered, and again, there are issues around whether Star Trek should be remastered to give us that kind of wider scope, but every time I watch an episode of Star Trek, I am suddenly realising I'm watching a square on my wall and not the widescreen kind of version. And so while fans could say, yes, maybe All Good Things was the better story, and I think I'm inclined to agree with them, All Good Things was also confined to the world of the TV because it had to hark back to earlier episodes. It had to be able to do that in order for the story to be told, and you can't change the image. You can't suddenly go back to the Enterprise, that look of season 1, and you know, season 1 of The Next Gen is incredibly troubled, so you can't get back to that look of season 1 and those awful uniforms and the whole thing. You can't. If you had tried to do that in the cinema, if you had tried to recreate that aesthetic,
then you'd be doing a kind of JJ style reboot. You'd have to do something with it, wouldn't you?
Yes,
you couldn't just recreate. And even so, they struggle slightly. I mean, like, some more than others, I think, get away with playing down 7 years. Patrick Stewart, of course, makes no difference. He doesn't age, seemingly anyway.
But
I think
Tasha
Brent
Yar
Spiner,
doesn't
you
work.
can tell. No, Denise Crosby, she just doesn't look quite the
Doesn't
same.
quite
And I
work.
think it's maybe partly there isn't, because she's been away for quite a period as well, you kind of notice it more. Frakes, they obviously didn't even bother trying. They had to use archive footage.
Right, yeah.
Someone was clearly like, yeah, okay, you could shave the beard, but there's no way anyone's going to buy that, you know.
My wife was the first person to point it out, and bear in mind this is her first watch of The Next Generation, but Megan looked at it the second, you know, and there I am raving about it. I mean, I still think All Good Things is absolutely fantastic. And there I am raving about it, and the second we cut to Picard and Yar in that shuttle, Megan looked at it and went, "No, that's not her 7 years ago. It doesn't look the same." And I then rewatched it with new eyes and went, "Yeah, you know what? You're right. Like, they do pull it off for a lot of them. I don't know. Do they pull it off for Deanna Troi because she's there?
I think she gets
It's
away
fine,
with it.
but
I would say. I mean, yeah, it's also, of course, you know, we now have the benefit of watching All Good Things in HD.
Yeah.
I mean, you can actually see someone on another podcast on Trek FM recently, they were doing a commentary on All Good Things, and they pointed out you can actually see the glue sticking Picard's beard on in a couple of shots. I mean, it's kind of, it was not designed to be seen in the level of quality that, although they were filming in this, you know, actually in sort of high quality on film or whatever, it was not intended that anyone would ever see it at that level. And that's another thing that comes out in the movie Generations that I saw. I think it was Herman Zimmerman, who was the designer on the film, was talking about in an interview, because they did decide to redesign things slightly. They did redesign the bridge, as well as lighting it very differently. They kind of moved things around a bit. They kind of opened out some of the areas and so on. They changed the shape, for example, of the window in Picard's ready room. So lots of things like that they thought they'd get away with. And he said, I think it was him who said basically what they decided was that what they wanted was for the fans to think, oh, that's what it looked like all along. It's just we didn't see it properly. Do you know what I mean?
Yes,
and that maybe what they wanted was to give them a glimpse of the Enterprise as it really was, as opposed to through the kind of slightly misty lens of the TV screen.
Yeah.
And I think there's absolutely some truth in that, because I remember watching those Blu-rays of Next Gen for the first time when they brought them out, and just being amazed at how different it looked from my memory of seeing Next Gen, back in the day, not to mention rewatching it more recently. The colours are so much more vibrant, the image is so much sharper, and there is that real sense of like, oh wow, and the same with the DS9 documentary recently.
Yes.
We're seeing the same thing with DS9 of like, wow, that is the show that we were seeing through a glass darkly. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
kind of and that really is what it was like. Here they were obviously fudging it slightly because they were reinventing things, but I don't feel I totally feel they get away with it. It doesn't bother me. It doesn't. It looks like the ship's had a slight facelift, but it's not. It's very much the same ship, and it looks the same inside and out. And a lot of the models, they brought back some of the models they hadn't used for years. They'd had when they first started making the show, and again rewired them, kind of spruced them up, did a lot of that. But it's not like they redesigned from scratch, if you know what I mean. There isn't that kind of there is an absolute continuity from the series into the film. Just the film is like Next Gen looking its best.
Absolutely. I think what they get away with, though, and this comes down to the uniforms partly as a kind of viewer, is that this is the Next Generation crew in transition. Now, fans, or anyone who knows the franchise, knows that kind of Star Trek continues. Star Trek hasn't finished. It's still going on in DS9 and it's still going on in Voyager. And I think by changing the uniforms slowly through the film, you get quite an interesting effect where then the look of the film, uniforms aside, becomes a kind of, okay, but this is an Enterprise in transition. Something's happening. The world is changing outside of the Enterprise. This isn't quite the 7 years that we saw. This is something different by putting people in uniforms. And of course there is a whole story to the uniforms. That there were the original uniforms that can now only be seen on action figures. I have been on eBay this week looking to see if I can get myself a set of those action figures.
I think Picard uniforms are quite similar to them, aren't they? Is that right? I think, or maybe it's the Lower Decks ones. Some of the uniforms that we've seen in some of the images
I think it's the Lower Decks ones because
look
it's
almost the same.
They do look almost the same because it's the collar.
Yeah.
Bears the colour.
Yeah.
And then it's black.
And then they've got the kind of original series breast panel thing going on. Yeah.
All in all, looking at the action figures, I can't say what they look like when Rick Berman said, no, don't do this. But looking at the action figures, I was like, that's absolutely hideous. And I'm very glad that never made its way. Well,
interestingly, the reason, about David Carson, who directed the film, said the reason they changed their mind, I mean, he may have been covering for the fact that they weren't happy with the uniform design, was that they felt that because they were doing all these tweaks to the ship, they didn't want to alienate the fans with too much new stuff. And obviously, arguably, by the time you get to First Contact, they've got a new ship, they've got new uniforms, everything is kind of new. It's a refresh, in a sense. But I think it is interesting, why did they not either go with the Next Gen uniforms or the DS9 Voyager uniforms? What does it mean that they're kind of, people are changing? And sometimes they are changing. It does seem a bit bizarre, like you're thinking, okay, so when did Riker find time to go and get a different uniform? And why is Picard back in his old uniform at the end when he was in the newer one? There is a sort of slight kind of musical chairs feeling to it, the way they keep swapping around. But you could say that they're moving to the dark. DS9 is the darkest show. It's one reason they wanted these uniforms, which are largely black. Riker's uniform in this, I think, is Avery Brooks's uniform because they didn't have time to make him his own one.
And indeed, LaForge's is also culmination.
Right, there you go.
Which is visibly too big for him.
Yeah. Which makes, it's true. You can see they've got the kind of sort of little pleaty bits where they obviously tried to kind of pull it in a bit. That's a good point. But I suppose you could say maybe it is, as you say, Enterprise in transition. It is maybe getting darker, and the film, as much as it's kind of a sort of holiday romp and a kind of passing of the torch and all this stuff, it's quite a dark film. I mean,
Absolutely.
it's not only is it about mortality, you know, you've got
Yeah.
Kirk dying twice, you've got Picard losing his family, you've got this sense of loss all the way through, but it's also got this quite kind of grown-up theme of, you know, the road not taken and kind of regrets for the life that you haven't lived, and, I mean, quite contemplative stuff going on in the midst of this slightly knockabout, slightly kind of all over the place plot. There's quite a lot in there, and some of it is quite serious.
Very serious. I think the themes of that film I find extremely resonant still now. I've got no idea what I thought as a kid. Like I said, I was along for the ride. I've watched it several times since. It is one of the next-gen films. Again, I've seen it derided by fans. I've never felt that way about it. I've always thought this is a film you can go back to and find some core, really crucial Star Trek themes are coming out of this film, about duty, about sacrifice, about what it means to be a captain, especially the Kirk on Picard scenes. And I understand that during filming that Shatner was actually very emotional, actually having to say the line, "You can't argue with the captain, I can't argue with the captain of the Enterprise, who am I to argue?"
Yeah.
You know, that for him was quite an emotional thing to say, because this is a passing of a torch. And then when you think about a documentary like The Captain's, well, yes, we get a bit more behind the scenes information on why this means so much. You know, other strange things. It was meant to be Carol Marcus, wasn't it, that was in the house with Kirk
really? Instead
at
of
one
Antonia,
point.
yeah.
You know, instead of this, you know, we've created Antonia, but again, I think at the executive level, they thought, well, we can't really hark back. You know, what would have been 12 years to that other film and Carol Marcus. So, you know what, we'll just stay down the line here. But Picard and his family as well. I have always, and will always, I think, find that scene incredibly emotional and difficult to watch, because you know, and I watched recently a colleague of mine said, came over to our house with her son and said, well, you've got a task today. My husband says you've got to show my son the best episodes of The Next Generation, because we know Star Trek Picard's coming up, and he's just about old enough, he's 10, to kind of understand these shows. He watched a bit of Discovery. And I said, well, this is a very difficult task, but if I've got to do it, I would have to put on The Best of Both Worlds Part 1 and Part 2. If you've got to introduce someone, you've got to say, this is where Next Gen, obviously Next Gen prior to that was an extremely problematic show, and I personally don't have much time for much content of either seasons 1 or 2, as I hope many fans also feel. And again, Chaos on the Bridge is an interesting insight into that. But so I showed those 2 episodes, and then we got to the end of those, and I said, but really, if you want to know where Next Gen decided to kind of push the envelope in terms of what television was doing at the time, especially in terms of what you might expect from a syndicated sci-fi show, you have to watch Family. Because that is the show, that is the episode that says this series is not just going to deal with a 2-parter and then forget that it ever happened. And we know that resonates because we know it comes up in later episodes like I, Borg and Descent, and we know it comes up in First Contact, and we know it's going to have an impact, we think, on what Star Trek Picard is going to focus on. But Family, and I can't, as someone who lives with his brother, you know, and you get that familial relationship in Family between Picard and his brother that I think I understand all too well, because I'm living it, and you watch them interact with each other as kind of very different but also very similar characters. And in Generations, that scene, although those few scenes where he realises that his brother's dead and his nephew's dead, my goodness, this is actually really bold. In my view, it's not the kind of, you know, The Next Generation pushed the envelope in so many ways, but ultimately was quite a woolly show where you could feel comfortable. The Best of Both Worlds and Family, maybe as an episode, is one of not feeling too comfortable, but it does end on very positive notes. And in Generations, I don't know that we're getting the positive notes.
Well, I wondered about that. I mean, is there a sort of... What's the kind of resolution to this film? And is there a kind of happy... Because Picard sort of seems okay by the end of the film. And that's one of the things that I do actually think is maybe a flaw of the film, is I felt watching it today anyway, that his journey is slightly missing something, because I think it's sort of implied that his experience in the Nexus somehow resolves his character journey, because when he comes out of it, he has that speech with Riker at the end where he seems quite kind of back to the old Picard. But I don't think they ever quite nail that. That's never quite hit, straight down the line enough for me. The whole storyline about his family, I mean, I think you're right, absolutely. At the beginning of the film, even just the way he gets that news on the holodeck, that scene with Troy in particular is absolutely, probably the best Picard Troy scene of the whole, 7+ years of Next Gen. Absolutely, incredibly moving, very well done by Patrick Stewart, beautifully lit and beautifully shot and everything as well. But also, I suppose the sticking point for a lot of people, I think, is his Nexus experience. And I did always think, I have to say, I always thought, this is a bit random and this is a bit silly, and why is he in a sort of hokey like PBS production of A Christmas Carol? And I know Patrick Stewart was doing Christmas Carols, that's probably partly where that came from, but the fact that they're all in this kind of Dickensian outfits and so on, it does, I do think they slightly dropped the ball in terms of the production design of that scene. I think if you shut your eyes and listen to that scene, it's actually quite effective. And for me, and maybe this is partly about getting older, maybe some of those themes about regrets and things like that resonate more when you're older. Maybe having kids makes you more aware of the potential for loss. Maybe having lost other people makes you more aware. I mean, that sense, I sort of bought it more this time around, that you can have that experience where you've lost someone in your life who's important to you, of having a dream and talking to them and then sort of half realising, hang on, but you're supposed to be dead, this can't be real. And I feel like that's sort of what Picard goes through in that moment. But you, before you realise that, you believe it's real. And I suppose that's what that scene has to sell, is the idea that only seconds after we've seen him in this kind of action-adventure scenario failing to stop Soren, then we see it, then the screen goes black. You get a couple of seconds of kind of black and silence in the theatre or whatever, because also we've just seen the Enterprise ripped to shreds by that wave, the supernova wave thing, and 1,000 people being killed horrifically. And then suddenly we have to buy that he's in this other place and he doesn't know really who he is or what's going on, or he doesn't remember what's just happened, or how he's got there, I suppose. And I think maybe the film doesn't totally sell that for me. But I think if you can kind of go along with the idea that this is like a dream, this is like a sort of, and they do kind of play with that in Kirk's as well. You walk through one door and you end up somewhere else in a different time and so on. There is something quite dreamlike about it. Then emotionally, maybe that beat does sort of work, and it does very much tie into Picard's story, into Picard's overall story about does he regret the decisions that he's made in his life and so on. And it is very moving. And again, when he says that to I think it's meant to be his son rather than his nephew at this point, he says go on without me, basically, that kind of letting go of this fantasy. It's very moving. It's much more moving than what we get with Kirk, on his horse. And again, Patrick Stewart really sells it. For me, it's just that the production design of that scene is so sort of overwhelming. It slightly undermines the emotional intent of the scene, because you're so distracted by it and thinking, why are we in even if it was in a sort of French like in Family, the family home, and it was all a bit rustic and whatever, okay, fine, you'd buy that. But why are we suddenly in Dickensian London in Picard's head? We know Patrick Stewart's English, we know that Picard is kind of literary and old-fashioned, but for me that even now that doesn't quite make sense as a fantasy. It seems weird. In
a similar fashion, Kirk's whole sequence is a nostalgia thing, but then actually, to me, while I agree with you completely about the design of both of those sequences, or both of those fantasies and the worlds that both of the captains go to, it's not about the captains, it's about the audience. It's attempting to affect, and there is a lot of research at the moment, including, I believe, just today I was sent a call for paper on a conference on science fiction on nostalgia. Mm-hmm. Special conference. Here we go. We're going to talk about science fiction, film or television in relation to nostalgia. Okay, cool. So this is a thing now, and I think it's always been there. And perhaps maybe now I'm formulating my paper, but just in those just in those two sequences, I don't think it's about Kirk, I don't think it's about Picard. I think it's about how can you affect an audience into thinking that this is somewhere they want to be. And while it's an imagined world, I suppose what's bizarre is it's an imagined history or life for Picard, but it's a real memory for Kirk.
That is confusing, I think, yeah. But to be honest, though, I buy Kirk's one because I've seen Star Trek V. I've seen him climbing the mountain.
Yes,
I can see that Kirk in his off hours, I totally buy that is what he might do. Mm-hmm. He's a kind of outdoorsy guy. He would be riding horses and chopping wood and stuff. I buy all of that. He probably would have a girlfriend. It's the thing with Picard, it just feels so... It's pushed too far somehow, and it's too much of a stretch. And I do think that is maybe one of the bigger missteps in this film, is that scene, because it kind of opens itself up to ridicule. Yeah. At just the point where you actually have to really buy into this idea of the Nexus, because the film only works if you totally accept the Nexus is going to grant you everything you want. It's going to be so seductive that only Captain Picard can resist it. Because I keep saying Patrick Stewart. Only Patrick Stewart can resist it. Only Captain Picard. I don't know if Patrick Stewart could resist it. We
don't know. He's not been sent there.
He's never been.
I did see an interview with him once where he said Malcolm McDowell is still there.
Yeah.
So right, okay. Maybe Malcolm couldn't resist it either.
No. Well, anyway, I mean, and of course we never get to see what Soren's Nexus is like, which might have been kind of interesting, or even Guinan's, which again would have been really interesting. But we see Kirk's and we see Picard's, and you kind of can't help thinking maybe it takes Kirk a bit longer because his fantasy is a bit more plausible. Picard actually. The terrible thing with this film is, like, in All Good Things... I mean, I know, admittedly, they wrote this film a year before All Good Things, weirdly, even though it follows on from it. But All Good Things, you get that final scene where Picard comes and he joins the rest of his crew, he plays poker with them, he says, I should have done this a long time ago. It's like he's letting go of his kind of slightly frosty side. They're all going to be friends, they're all going to be this great family. In Generations, you get one scene where Picard gets to be happy and joke around and have fun, and then he finds out his family are all dead. And that's it. And the rest of the film, he has to go around sort of moping and feeling miserable and shutting himself off again from his entire crew, basically, and literally going into his room and hiding from them and saying, I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not, and ironically, he has that speech with Data saying sometimes you have to learn to integrate your emotions. He's not doing that at all. He's completely just shutting the door on anyone else. And even on his job, I mean, he walks off the bridge in the middle of effectively a crisis and says to Riker, you deal with it. I'm not interested. I couldn't care less about this. And even with Troy, it takes quite a bit of nudging, and he's sort of slightly in denial, saying it's all right, it's all right, and talking about his nephew as if he's still alive and so on. There's that real sense that, he's not really accepting his emotions at all, but also just that he doesn't get to be happy for more than 5 minutes, and then in the Nexus he thinks he's going to be happy, and it's probably like 2 minutes in the Nexus scene before he realises this is wrong, this is not right. I'm Captain Picard, I'm not going to be fooled by exactly. Seeing those little supernovas.
What is Whoopi Goldberg doing behind that tree?
Exactly. And why is there a merry-go-round in my living room?
Exactly. There's something interesting, though, if you have to talk about the difference between television and a kind of film, and that's what really, I suppose, the Next Generation cast and crew, the writers, everyone, was dealing with at this stage, is the transition between the two things. The Next Generation quite famously moved in the third season to a sort of character-driven model that we're going to tell weekly episodes, but they're going to be about our people, and we're going to get to know Geordi, and we're going to get to know Worf, and we're going to get to know Data. These are the people who are critical to our story more broadly, but these are the people who we want to focus on week by week. But the Hollywood model, and this is going back a long way, the Hollywood model of telling stories is the hero's journey. This is Joseph Campbell's monomyth that got, I would say, either adapted or perhaps bastardized into a kind of way to generate Hollywood screenplays. And by the time that's done, and you could possibly talk about a lot of the original series movies in this context as well, but by the time that's done, there's only room for one hero. We cannot talk about ensembles here. They don't belong. So there's a hero, and there's a hero and he's on a journey. And in Generations, it's quite plain that Picard is the hero, and he's on a journey, and the audience are following him on his journey through grief, through acceptance, through which I don't think quite plays, if I'm honest. Like, I still respect the film, but I think if you look at it from that point of view, it is found wanting, especially because of this, as you say, the weird Dickensian Christmas, and I don't. But it's that transition from being able to tell stories week by week and be able to proudly say, which I'm not sure the Next Gen ever quite did. Certainly later shows like Deep Space Nine absolutely did. We have an ensemble here, we're all together. But the Next Gen did in a way do that week by week. Again, some of those episodes are phenomenal, some of those are absolutely unwatchable. But here are our characters, and this is who we're putting forward. And again, in the movies, they get lost.
See, I felt this film actually did a better job than some of the original series movies of at least giving everyone something to do. Maybe it's not that interesting. Maybe it's a bit... So some of them get more to do than others. But they... Geordie sort of gets not exactly a storyline, really, but they get moments. Do you know what I mean? They get decent moments. I mean, I saw an interview with LeVar Burton, which I thought was quite interesting, where he pulled out something that I had never really even registered for me in the film particularly, but he said he particularly liked the fact that Geordie was looking after those kids when the saucer was crashing, because he thought that brought out a side of Geordie's character that you wouldn't really expect. So I think it's difficult. I know what you mean, and I think with the films there's always a sense of they're kind of trying to tick off the boxes and make sure, and you get that with the original series films as well, make sure everyone has something to do, and ideally one good scene so that that actor can feel like it was worth their time turning up for the film, and the fans of that character can feel like they got something. And Michael Dorn apparently was very angry about the opening scene with Worf going in the water, and spent 2 hours in a meeting with Braga and Moore basically trying to talk them out of it, and eventually gave up because they insisted that it was worth it and it was funny. And I actually think, interestingly, I think that scene is funny, and it's probably the only funny thing in this film that for me works as it's intended to, because I think that you talked about Picard's journey. Picard's got this big emotional journey. Data has sort of got this big... Data has literally got this big emotional journey, and he's got his emotion chip, but it's played almost completely. There are one or two kind of... I mean, it's got a touching moment at the end with Spot. It's got a kind of slightly scary bit somewhere along the way where it's kind of freaking him out and so on. But broadly speaking, he just becomes comic relief. And for me, that's one of the things that really doesn't work about the film at all, because I think as much as, ironically, they thought they were taking Data forward by giving that emotion chip. And I saw an interview with Brannon Braga, and he was saying, we felt, we don't have to, we can take more risks with the character. It's not like a TV show where you couldn't change a character too much. This is a film, we don't know, there might be another one in a few years, we can change the character. But I think actually what they did in that film is took him back to season 1 Data, where he's totally kind of gauche, he's totally like out of step with everyone else, he's not fitting in, he's over the top. Brent Spiner is hamming it up the whole time. And I actually think that's one of the problems with the film, is this kind of, yes, Data having emotions is potentially interesting, but Data being totally unprofessional and just annoying everyone and saying inappropriate comic things in the middle of a dramatic scene is not actually helpful. And it actually made me think in some ways is that another element of the comedy in the film that works, though, noticeably in that prologue, in the original, you get Scotty to Kirk, you get the line, is there something wrong with your chair, Captain? That is classic original series comedy. It's all this kind of slightly puncturing Kirk's sort of standing in a way, and undermining that, and you get a lot of fantastic comedy out of that because it's character comedy and it's really kind of earned character comedy. Whereas I think some of the comedy in this film with the Next Generation crew, as much as I love them, it doesn't feel as organic as that. It doesn't feel as natural as that. It feels like, okay, here's a joke because we've got to put some jokes in this film, and we've got to put some jokes in the trailer. And actually, when you're watching it in those scenes in context, you just start thinking, God, Data's annoying in this film, and he was my favourite character. What's going on? They've just turned him into something sort of tedious. I think in Next Gen, the times when they do comedy, and maybe it does work. I mean, I have a real soft spot for A Fistful of Datas, for example. I know some people hate that episode. They think it doesn't work. For me, it works. I find it very charming, and it does make me laugh. And I think they get away with it more when they all get to dress up and be someone else. It works better than when they're being their slightly stuffed shirt Starfleet types. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
so and maybe that's why that first scene on the boat actually is quite funny. I mean, and that whole thing about Data pushing Crusher into the sea, and then Geordie comes out and says that was not funny, and you think, yeah, it was. That's probably the funniest moment in the film. Actually, Data's got it. That's the funniest thing that Data does in this entire movie.
The whole film.
When his storyline is ostensibly comic. So I mean, I don't know. Maybe it is just that thing of what's funny when they're all dressed up is they become slightly ridiculous, and they are such serious characters and such kind of noble and kind of straight down the line characters that it takes that. Now, Kirk got that with the movies because they almost sort of reinvented Kirk in the movies as this kind of flawed and almost slightly ridiculous character. The movies really punctured his kind of ego, because you do get that sense of Kirk in the original series, and of William Shatner incidentally, probably, as someone with quite an ego, quite a sort of regard for himself, and the movies absolutely go to town with kind of puncturing that, and that's where you get a lot of the kind of real comedy, character comedy from in that. I don't think anyone would ever dare do that to Picard, and I mean, of course, we'll have the Picard series coming along. We saw in the trailer, I guess, 7 of 9 giving Picard a bit of a hard time. No one is going to manage to do to Picard what they did to Kirk in those movies, of like chipping away at who he is and as his kind of heroism, because Picard is such a kind of noble figure. Do you know what I mean? And it would be too problematic, I think, to kind of undermine that. You can undermine Kirk because he's a charmer and he's a kind of, and also because so much of his kind of heroism is bound up in him being this handsome young guy, and obviously he's a lot older by the point they start making the films and so on. They can kind of play on all that. I just think it doesn't, and maybe that's one reason as well why the Next Gen films are less successful than the original series films, because the original series films were really very much about that cast getting older and kind of losing some of their power and losing some of their certainly losing their youth. Do you know what I mean? And how that affects them, and how do they deal with that? And even in this film, you've got, when did Sulu have a child, and how old they all feel, and Chekhov saying, I can't believe, was I ever that young? And you sort of buy all of that. I think with the Next Gen cast, they couldn't quite do the same thing, because they were all so grown up anyway. It's almost like they haven't got, there are no illusions to be disillusioned about. There are no, do you know what I mean? Because
and it was
it's hard to puncture those characters somehow.
And it was made yesterday. I mean, they're there. They're right there. They haven't grown. I mean, that's what I thought All Good Things did so well. I thought that what that did so well was give us a glimpse into the future of these characters that we've got to know, and that future looks less than perfect.
And they're all kind of jerks, basically. I mean, Riker's totally pretty unpleasant. Data is unbearable. LaForge seems all right.
LaForge seems fine. Crusher seems
overwritten.
Crusher seems okay, but there's obviously a bit of a, in fact, actually, I loved Captain Crusher, I've got to say. I thought she was absolutely fantastic, and I still have the action figure in case anyone's wondering. So I thought, she really, she hit some notes for me. I thought, that's absolutely brilliant. Of course you were going to do that. I can't say I was too sorry that Troy died, actually, but that was...
Well, that's a discussion for another time.
It is. That's an entire podcast.
I mean, there's a whole, talking about generations, there's a whole controversy, of course, about, the woman driver and Troy crashing the ship and so on. And I've heard Marina Sirtis talking about that and basically saying, look, she's the one who managed to crash land this ship and not kill a single person on the Enterprise. in a very difficult situation. I don't know. It never crossed my mind that Troy did anything wrong. It seemed quite impressive to me at the time that she was able to take over that role. And we know she's done the bridge officer thing. She should be able to do it. But that was a pretty scary moment, and she acquitted herself pretty well, I'd say.
So lest we forget that I believe Marina Sirtis actually got physically burned doing the scene.
Did she? Right.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, that scene, I mean, talking about the transition from TV to cinema, that is the scene. I mean, that's the scene I remember, as a kid watching this film and being blown away by it. That scene goes on and on and on, and it's really well done. You can watch the documentaries, the like special features and stuff, all about how they shot that sequence with the model. They were literally dragging that saucer along on the truck and smashing through this kind of all these little ferns and things they built up and painted and so on. And they had to. It's quite interesting. I don't know if you've seen it. They had to shoot the whole thing through a mirror because they didn't want to destroy their very expensive camera in the process. So you've got that shot, which is an absolutely, it's a practical shot. It's not a kind of CGI shot, although there is a little bit of CGI. There is CGI in this film, but that was totally sort of practical shot. Really tense, really effective. When that saucer is about to crash, you're literally on the edge of your seat. And then the crash itself goes on and on and on and on. And at a certain point, this is something that struck me watching it today. It is quite artfully done. I think more so, I mean, they couldn't have done it on the TV budget, but also just the film is quite cinematic in that it takes artistic decisions from time to time, interesting kind of creative decisions. The music cuts out quite early on in that crash, and you're just left with the sound effects of everything smashing. A lot of it, you're left with these kind of close up on Riker's face, close up on Worf's face, this kind of it totally immerses you in that experience. And the fact that it seems to go on much longer than you expect, I think, makes it feel quite traumatic and quite sort of powerful, because there's a point where it's hit the ground and it's slowing down. You sort of think, okay, fine, that's it. They're not dead. They're not going to die from this. And yet it goes on and on and on and on and on. And then even at the end, when they've all been like thrown out of their chairs and everything, and it's also the fact that it keeps getting worse and worse. So this bridge gets damaged to the level that you might see on the TV show. Then it gets more damaged. Then more things start falling out of the ceiling. Then there are kind of RSJs or something coming out of it, who knows where. The damage gets worse and worse and worse. The lights go out, it gets completely black basically in there, and then finally it stops and there's this kind of moment of silence. And I think that's another thing this film does well, which the TV show would never have done, is it does there are several points where it stops for a good few seconds of either silence or maybe a little bit of music or something to kind of and relax, and now take a breath, and now we'll move on to the next bit. And then you get that, again, an amazing shot of the saucer crashed and that huge sort of swathe of jungle ripped out by it, basically. Again, really kind of selling the scale of what's just happened, really selling what a huge object this is that has just crashed to Earth. And you get that as well with the shot where you can kind of see the very edge of the saucer, and it's not a point, it is a couple of decks, I think, isn't it? Because you've got to turn forward and everything there, and you get that sense again of the scale and the little people you can see on the top just before that wave comes and explodes.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, you can see them all there.
Which apparently was all the VFX crew in the Paramount car park wandering around, and then they sort of composited them onto the saucer. Top of the ship. But it totally worked for me. I just think that's probably the highlight of the film as a piece of cinema.
And I suppose what's bizarre is that's what is that doing? That is made up for in the budget by recycling footage from the Undiscovered Country.
Yeah.
When they blow up the Klingon bird of prey. I mean, that's what's very interesting. I suppose there's a few things we could hit on here actually in discussion, but that's what's very interesting in having a franchise that crosses TV and film. You've got, so to make the film, and I suppose what's worth pointing out now, and I assume a lot of people know this, but maybe they don't, is that a lot more is riding on a cinematic release than is riding on a TV movie. Mm-hmm. The studio wants a return. It is not good enough. And we know from our last discussion on Nemesis, we know what happens when they don't get the return.
Yeah.
So we have here a film that has enormous expectation to come in under budget and to bring us back some money. And the only reason it can come in under budget is because all of the material kind of existed already. You know, we knew we had the ship, we had the sets, we had. They might undergo a kind of minor redress, but we already have them, and this is absolutely key. And this is why I suppose new uniforms. I don't think they got poo-pooed by Berman because of the budget. I think they got poo-pooed because they looked awful. But it's that's the thing, isn't it? We've got a budget here, and the less we spend on the making of the film, including the recycling of footage. And I knew that as a kid watching it for the first time. Mm-hmm. I could spot that was the same bird of prey explosion and the same shots of it blowing up as the undiscovered country. I knew that straight away. And in a way, I mean, it doesn't detract from the film at all, so it doesn't matter. But it is interesting where the money then gets spent. Mm-hmm. That's the big question. We know, again, historically from Star Trek, it's not on actor salaries. Mm-hmm. So where is this money going? And it will be into moments like that. The Enterprise saucer, that entire still a largely practical a practical effects shot. I mean, it takes time, and it takes money, it takes people, it takes a crew to pull that kind of shot off. Yeah. But you can see where maybe David Carson, but I don't think the director himself, but certainly the producers above have gone, all right, where have we got money for this? How can we actually put this whole thing together?
And I think they were shaving money. I mean, I think they originally had a more extensive use of locations they wanted to go to and so on, and they did scale back. I think they saved about $5 million off the original budget by making changes of various kinds of the script and so on. I don't feel that it ever feels... You're right, they reuse stuff. They reuse some old props. They reuse a lot of sets, obviously, etc. Star Trek kind of always done that. It doesn't ever feel cheap to me. If you look at, say, Star Trek 5, which feels a bit like a knockoff in some respects, you can see the budgetary savings going on there. And actually, although they reuse that bird of prey shot, it's quite quick. It really doesn't register. It doesn't look like it doesn't fit. And actually, the interiors, again, the explosion within the bird of prey is very well done. There's a lot of fire. There's people being like sucked off frame, which is quite interesting. You don't really see them being sucked off in space, but you get a sense of that going on. There's a lot of action in that space. That set looks fantastic. It looks a million times better than it's ever looked, in Star Trek 3 or, in Star Trek 4. It's basically the same set, but they made it look much, much better. Or even than it ever looks in DS9, where they basically use that same set again and again. They do really make the most, I think, of everything that's in there. And absolutely, they make the most. I mean, one of the best decisions I think that was taken was, you said they don't pay the actors a lot. I don't know what they paid this Academy-nominated cinematographer, maybe a bit more than they would have paid someone else, but I think it works. Do you know what I mean? Like, you can tell someone really good has visually styled this film. It's absolutely beautiful. It's very interesting visually, I think, compared to Next Gen. I mean, we're talking about these sort of adult themes of like loss and grief and so on. It's incredibly dark visually, and I suppose partly that's the transition from a TV set in the corner in a lit room where you need to be able to see everything, it's all bright and clear and so on, and the lighting is all quite flat, to a cinema where you're in complete darkness, and it feels like a film that is designed for a cinema experience rather than kind of home. I mean, I watched it on my iPad. I feel like that's not the way. So it's probably better
Definitely
in your living room on the projector.
Totally.
Because just the lighting is quite dark. It's quite interesting. They make the most of that sort of sunset effect on the ship, where you've got the kind of big dark shadows coming in. Because you've got this kind of sun. I mean, so much of the film feels like it's taking place at sunset or kind of twilight. You've got this Guinan's room, which is all lit by candlelight. You've got even like the Klingon ship is pretty dark and shady, and even like incidental sets, almost like say Data's quarters. It's all like accent lighting, no kind of big overhead lighting. Everything is lit with these kind of minute little lights around the set, really kind of lots of shadows everywhere. And then by the end of the film, you get this effect where literally when it almost feels like it all comes together, because when Soren launches that thing and destroys the star, you get an instant eclipse, and suddenly, again, you're plunged into sunset, basically, and kind of twilight, and that kind of dark quality, and you get these beautiful visuals. I mean, that place where they filmed Fire Valley, something like that, Valley of Fire, I think, State Park. Stunning anyway, you know, this kind of otherworldly landscape. But suddenly they have an excuse to kind of shoot in that kind of, do they call it the golden period? You know, that kind of
golden hour.
Yeah. Exactly. Absolutely beautiful. But, you know, both when Soren is being taken away and then at the end of the film with Kirk's, you know, Picard sort of mourning Kirk's loss and so on, again, you get that lighting. And it ties totally in with the visual look of the entire film, which is very warm and is very kind of sunsetty, almost these kind of orange hues to everything. Very different to anything you see on Next Gen. The only thing I can think of in Star Trek that gets close to it is there's that episode of Enterprise, directed by LeVar Burton, where they kind of pull the same trick with the sun, and they have some beautiful shots with kind of this sort of sunsetty effect. But I mean, it totally defines the kind of visual look of this film, I think. And again, very cinematic, very much not the kind of pale, you know, people always talk about Next Gen as the Hilton in space, that kind of, you know, comfortable, well-lit look. It's very much darker, much more shadow, much more interesting interplay of light and dark. Even Kirk in the deflector control room, you know, really dark scene, these patterns playing across his face the whole time, the isolinear chips kind of casting all these different colours on him. Picard on the merry-go-round, there's these weird coloured lights from the kind of out-of-focus baubles, you know, the Christmas tree lights, these kind of decorations. You get all these kind of interesting uses of lens flares. Actually, you know, years before J.J. Abrams came in, when they've got their palm torches out and they're going into the station in the dark, lens flares galore all over the screen, you know, because again it's dark and you're seeing little patches of light and patches of light here and there, but the kind of environment of the film is generally pretty dark. And it's weird because we think of First Contact as the Next Generation going dark, but actually, and then Insurrection as the opposite, you know, pulling things back into the TV kind of aesthetic. This film is incredibly dark.
Absolutely, and as you say, the uniforms lend themselves to that. If we go coloured stripe, and black top, then we've got much less in the design sense, in the kind of aesthetic to kind of light our scene. There's nothing bouncing off the top.
And it emphasises the face as well.
Absolutely, and the whole film. I always think about that scene. I agree with you as well. Incidentally, it's the best Troy Picard scene there ever was.
She does good counselling, you know.
In that scene,
she speaks the truth. She's you know, she's there for him. She knows what's going on. She says the right thing. She intuits. I mean, you know, we know she's kind of empathic, vaguely telepathic, whatever that means. She does get what's playing on his mind in that way that you think, okay, this is why it would be good to have a counsellor who has like superpowers, because she can hit the nail on the head. And he says, yes, that's it. That's exactly, you know, as if he hasn't quite joined the dots himself.
The way the scene is shot, that's what it's about. It's about the and positioning themselves by the Amagosa star as it's about to go nova, or is close to going nova, is what gives them that light. It's fantastic. It's absolutely beautiful. It is not the show.
No, it's not Star Trek. That's the weird thing. It's totally not Star Trek. Even DS9 is the closest to that. They get a bit more, and you do have that kind of accent lighting and the kind of slightly different lighting on DS9. But absolutely, when you think of Star Trek, you think brightly lit, to the extent that even when J.J. Abrams reimagined Star Trek, it becomes the Apple Store. It becomes you know, totally white, bright, everything is, you know, and that's what we think of as Star Trek. We do not think of these kind of shadowy, murky, dark scenes where you need a torch to see what's going on.
But they did it, and they did it then. And that scene I always remember as the one that was lit. You know, Troy at one end of the room and Picard at the other, and it's quite dark in between them. And, you know, what's actually going on here? And she's almost dimly lit at the end of the room. You can't really see her. She's there. I don't know. I thought it was absolutely wonderful, the way it was shot. Really, really well considered. And from a director who'd done long-time stuff on the Next Gen, which I thought was really cool, quite necessary, actually. As we discussed in our last podcast, having a director who knows the characters and knows the show is a really important aspect. And I think David Carson himself was surprised when they asked him to do the film. But I think that it shows that there's someone there who knows the characters, who knows the material, and knows the universe, i.e. not Stuart Baird.
Yeah. And I mean, incomparably more successful than Baird. I know a lot of people feel like Jonathan Frakes was the kind of, with First Contact, that was the ideal director, maybe. But I think, Carson, I would say, does a great job as a director. The only area where I feel slightly uncertain about this film, I suppose, is around I was going to say the pacing. I don't know I think it's a mixture of pacing and structure, and maybe the editing, actually. One of the segments that doesn't quite work for me, although, as I say, the crash itself is incredibly effective, is that you're cutting back and forth between that and Picard and Soren on the planet. And I feel like there's a slight expectation that, like, we've got this beautiful scenery, we've got these two fantastic British actors attempting to chew this magnificent scenery, and that's going to somehow be enough. But actually, what I felt is that the energy always falls slightly flat when you get back to Picard and Soren. And it's a shame, because I do like, obviously it goes without saying Patrick Stewart's brilliant. I think Malcolm McDowell is good in this film. I think he's a good villain. I think it sort of works. I think their dynamic works. But I think trying to cut back and forth between their conversations, which are not massively dramatic, and this huge action spectacle is a big mistake. I mean, that's presumably comes down to the script and the way it's put together. But I feel like that is an issue. And I do feel the pacing of the film slows down a lot, just as and the structure of it is weird, because you've built towards this confrontation between Picard and Soren, which you would think would be the kind of third act climax of the film. It actually comes about halfway through the film and doesn't really go anywhere. And then you have this big detour where Picard has to go and get Kirk and then kind of replay it all and do it all again. And then you have this whole issue about, does the ending work? And they had to reshoot it and so on. And why is, for me, the sort of stuff, the interactions in the nexus between Kirk and Picard work quite well as character stuff. But there is a slight sense, it feels a little bit like Kirk's just Picard's plus one back to this party that he wasn't, that didn't work out the first time. Do you know what I mean? And it could have been anyone. It doesn't feel like that. Maybe part of the problem with that climax is it doesn't really play to either Picard or Kirk's strengths. They're both okay in a fight. I mean, obviously we know Kirk was great in a fight once upon a time, but probably not so much now. It almost could have been anyone on that bridge performing that role. And I do feel like that maybe is a slight failing of the film, that it doesn't justify, why is it Kirk and why is it Picard in this situation? And what do because this is the big question the film sort of has to answer. If you get Kirk plus Picard, what does that equal? Because that should be something pretty darn big and special, right? Yeah. They should be absolutely, as much as we might say, Kirk and Spock complement each other, or, these kind of, or Kirk, Spock and McCoy complement, these kind of ideas of, again, sort of is something bigger than the sum of its parts. I guess you get it, it's all this stuff these days. There was that meme, wasn't there, about the greatest crossover event in history or whatever.
Oh, with the Avengers.
Exactly. And with the Avengers, you've got this thing of like, how do you bring all these characters together and make them bigger than the sum of their parts? You get it a lot these days, with other kind of TV franchises and so on, of doing these kind of crossovers.
I loved those.
This was not the original, but this
it
was
a big crossover.
Be, the biggest crossover event in Star Trek history.
Yeah.
And much more. I mean, obviously, Star Trek's done other ones. We had Bones in the first episode of Next Gen. We've had other characters. We've had Sulu in Voyager and so on. But this is the big.
This is the one.
These are the two big. As much as you've got Captain Janeway here on your desk, but for years anyway, it was always who's the better captain, Kirk or Picard, and those were the two choices. And the idea of putting them together, although Brannon Braga apparently originally wanted them to fight each other. He said his original concept for this film was just an image of Kirk's Enterprise and Picard's Enterprise shooting at each other. Now, clearly that wouldn't work because Picard's Enterprise would just blow the other one up, right? Like that's common sense. But the idea of the two of them at loggerheads fighting each other, which I think you do get. I haven't watched all the Marvel films, but you do get that to some extent in some of them, I think, don't you? Conflict between these characters.
Yeah, you do.
Are heroes in their own films and in their own rights. They obviously didn't feel they could go down that route, which I think is understandable. But I don't think they really ever answer that question of Kirk plus Picard equals what exactly.
Yeah.
It seems like it's just one extra person so that you can have one on either side of Soren. And even then, he
how
kind of
high
beats
the stakes.
Proverbial out of both of them. To
Yes,
some
that's
extent,
right.
you know.
Yeah, it is really interesting, isn't it? And I think, I always enjoyed those memes about the this is the most ambitious crossover ever. I did see one that you'll appreciate of Sooty and Sweep and the cast of Rainbow.
Exactly.
That
There
said, everyone's saying Marvel's the most ambitious
Yeah.
TV crossover, but they've forgotten
Yeah.
that this one,
Yeah.
these two shows once combined. And so, I suppose for guys working now in Marvel and guys working now in Star Trek as well, are feeling, I would say confined by the need to make sure that everything crosses over and that everything makes narrative sense across a much larger franchise than one film. And I do, but having said that, I do agree with you that this is completely underplayed. Kirk plus Picard, where the stakes are relatively high, but they're not very high in comparison to stuff that maybe Kirk did on his own and Picard did on his own.
Do you know because it's only a random 280 million people that we never see?
That's right.
I mean, there is an argument that the fact that we never even see them, because I feel like Star Trek can do that, and films can do that. It's weird that we don't even see them kind of looking up at the sky and kind of thinking, "Oh, what's that thing that's about to kill us all?" These pre-industrial people. We don't ever get any link to them, and I always forget when I watch this film. Although it makes sense that because you think, okay, there's that crash sequence, you think, oh great, Troy saved everyone, the crash was well done insofar as no one died on the ship, and then they all get obliterated in this like half-second shot, which is pretty shocking because you see the saucer being ripped apart with people standing on top of it, and not that you can see the bodies flying up or whatever, but you kind of get that, it's a bit like seeing a building coming down with people in it or something, and obviously then it never happens ultimately, but it did happen in the same sense as we've seen the Enterprise blow up and then it never happened in the past. But I suppose arguably, Kirk obviously has saved Earth in the past. Picard is certainly going to save Earth in the next movie, and in the fourth, in two of his four movies, he's going to end up saving Earth one way or another. I mean, maybe that is part of it. I don't know if it is so much about the stakes. I mean, you could argue also that Soren, as much as I think Malcolm McDowell is good and is well cast and so on, is there something... He's not quite what you'd expect. If you're thinking of a Star Trek villain as kind of like a Bond villain, he doesn't seek power. I mean, Guinan says, he's not interested in weapons, he's not interested in power, he just has this one thing that he wants and he doesn't care what happens in order to get it. I feel like I quite like that, at least in principle. I think on paper that sounds good. I do sort of wonder whether is that part of the reason that something feels a little bit small in the third act, because he's not... Although it's Malcolm McDowell and he's kind of crazy and scary, and we've seen we've seen Malcolm McDowell can do like psycho scary stuff. Actually, what he wants, he's quite sympathetic, which is good, I think, because you can understand why he wants it. But his ambitions are his ambition is actually fairly minimal. It's just the cost that it's going to involve to get there. And you do sort of wonder, could he not have just done a few more supernovas and found a planet there wasn't anyone living in that system, and then no one would care.
Yes,
but,
that's right. Yeah.
But we have to buy. He's spent 80 years working on this plan, and this is the only way he's going to do it. And he's rationalised it and decided it's okay. I don't know. I think for me that is that if there is a flaw with this film, I think there are flaws with this film. As I say, I don't think the data stuff really works, and I think that just as a story, the third act is where it struggles a bit. And I think it's interesting. They shot it, they screened it, they reshot it. Did they ever quite get it right? I suppose that's the question.
No, I'm not sure they did. For a variety of reasons. Again, this is me saying I respect the film hugely and find it incredibly rewatchable, more so than either Insurrection or Nemesis. I think it does a great job of what it's trying to do. But no, as you say, what are the stakes here? Kirk plus Picard equals and it should have been huge. We've seen bigger stuff come afterwards. We've seen DS9 do the Dominion War. We've seen Discovery try and kind of reboot and look at a kind of the Klingon War that we knew had happened but didn't know anything about. And the stakes in all those things are huge. And surely, if you're going to bring together these two iconic characters, the stakes need to be that big. And for want of sounding absolutely awful, really, but 280 million on one planet. Who do they die, or do they just kind of end up in the Nexus?
In which case,
what the hell are we doing? You've just taken the Enterprise crew and 280 million happy Viridians out of the Nexus.
I don't think they do end up in the Nexus, because I don't think the Enterprise crew end up in the Nexus, because if you the way you see the ribbon go past Picard and Soren and they vanish, and you actually and then you see the landscape is still there and they're not there. It takes them somewhere else. It's like Guinness says, it's a portal to somewhere else. Now you don't see the ribbon. The ribbon is they're on the other side of the planet, I guess, to the crashed ship, and the ribbon is not. I mean, he has to climb up his platform that he's built, as well as bringing it near enough in order to. Well, he doesn't, because Picard gets it and he's a bit lower down. Who knows? But I think we have to accept they're on the wrong. The Enterprise crew are on the wrong side of the planet. They just get blown up.
Yes.
They don't get whisked
through
away
the supernova
beforehand. Exactly.
Yes, totally.
And the Viridians, sadly,
Same
their
deal.
industrial civilization gets flattened at the same time.
Absolutely.
So but then it's almost this kind of flaw that we get with the next gen movies, and you get it again with Insurrection, where Picard is making kind of moral point, but it feels slightly abstract. At least in cinematic terms, it doesn't feel quite emotionally connected enough. And I know a lot of people, not to get diverted into a whole debate about Insurrection, but I think a lot of people felt with Insurrection the problem was that while in principle you might agree with Picard, his argument there seems a little bit kind of rational and a bit sort of untethered to anything emotionally resonant. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Partly maybe because the people in that film seem fairly laid back and chilled about everything anyway, and partly just because of the way that argument he has with the Admiral in that scene plays out. And in some ways it's quite similar to the argument he has with Soren in this film, where he's sort of saying, what you're doing is wrong, you're going to kill all these people, your people were killed by the Borg, you know this is wrong. And Soren's like, I don't care, I'm not interested. And really Picard can't win that argument. That's the weird thing. And Picard is the guy who makes great arguments. I mean, in All Good Things, there's that great scene, although psychologically I don't really buy it. I buy it totally dramatically, where he has to convince the crew of the Enterprise, who've never met him before, to go on what is clearly a mad suicide mission for a captain who's making no sense whatsoever. And he gives this great impassioned speech and says, you're going to have to trust me, I will need a leap of faith. And they all, sign up and go, we don't get that, because actually Picard is not able to convince these people in the movies, because in the movies it's necessary to, blow stuff up and kill people in order to get what you need, or get what you want. And somehow maybe there's something slightly underpowered and underplayed. Again, even between these two great, English actors, there's still something slightly underplayed about that, because it's kind of, again, this kind of moral argument about something, about these other people on a planet that is over there somewhere, and we never see them, and we only understand about the stakes affecting them kind of in theory, because we watched the demonstration in that beautiful new set.
Yes, on the
Picard and Data in the stellar cartography set, which actually, you're talking about spending the money. That is one set they did build from scratch.
Yes, totally.
And it was the biggest set they'd ever built.
Yeah.
And apparently it was not in the script. In the script, it just said an office with some screens on the walls. And it was Herman Zimmerman who looked at it, and he was like, no, I'm going to build something for this film. I'm going to go to town on this one, and it's going to be the biggest set you've ever seen. It's going to be wraparound, and it's going to have this thing. There's quite a funny interview with Patrick Stewart on one of the special features for Generations, saying he was actually quite basically suffering vertigo in that set, and he said it reminded him of being a kid and going out on the high diving board, and all his friends goading him to jump in the pool, and he was just standing there terrified, because it was this huge thing, unlike anything we saw in Next Gen. But I think that was another thing of I don't know what it cost them, but showing this is the cinema, we're going to do something a little bit big and a little bit special. And I would say that again, it worked insofar as that set is one of the things that you remember from the film. But I think it's interesting, this question of like, what is the role of when you go from the TV straight to the big screen, bridging that gap. And when we talked a bit about how the film is very cinematic, it does, interestingly, that very final scene with Picard and Riker on the bridge of the Enterprise D has a moment where it feels like it's a finale. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because they're saying goodbye to that ship, and obviously they didn't say goodbye to. They said goodbye. They sort of wrapped a lot of stuff up emotionally and and kind of thematically and plot-wise and so on in all good things. But they still have that scene where they're basically saying, right, this is the last time we're going to see this ship, and we kind of have to accept that and move on, and the future is going to be different and so on. And that to me is weird, because that feels like a scene from a series finale somehow, that somehow got dropped into this film, and it's the final beat of the film as well, so it carries a lot of kind of weight. But I'm kind of curious, what do you think about, I mean, there are a lot of other TV properties that have done this. I mean, the X-Files was doing it just a couple of years after this one, and had some of the same challenges in that they were writing, worse challenges in some ways, in that they were writing for a film that had to fit within a much more complex continuity than Star Trek has ever had, certainly up to this point, and also go from the TV series into the film and then back into the TV series, and somehow make the film stand alone and be different and cinematic, but also fit as an episode so you could watch it kind of within that run. And other shows obviously have done similar things. I mean, one of my favourites was the South Park movie. I love that movie.
Yes,
bigger, longer, and uncut. And they got away with like a lot of swearing, a lot of stuff that they couldn't do, I think, on the TV. They pushed massively in the cinema. And that was, watching that, I was blown away. Not so much like the Crash in Generation, but I was like, wow, they're really going there, and they're doing that, and they can do all of this. And it made me think South Park is a series that was quite risque and pushing things. You suddenly in the cinema, you're like, okay, they've got a 15 certificate, whatever, they can do whatever the hell they like, and it shows. Yeah. But you do get a lot of Sex and the City did a big sort of spectacular tour of them, ramp everything up, get the helicopters out, try and bling up the whole thing, but still focus on these characters. But in a British context, you've also got, on the buses, you've got, do you know what I mean? All these, Alan Partridge.
Yes,
Alan Partridge did great, because he actually did a kind of action movie, which I think was kind of inspired of, kind of blending that, almost a sort of meta commentary on the fact that they're doing a big film out of this rather small property character and so on. But quite a lot of British comedies, Kevin and Perry Go Large, often not with huge success, but anything that's popular enough. And of course, it's not quite out in the cinemas yet as we're recording, but it might be by the time this episode drops. Downton Abbey, hugely, massively anticipated movie, for fans of that TV show. And I don't know what you do there, because that TV show was so much of the charm of that TV show was like how gorgeous it looked and how beautifully it was shot, and this amazing building that they were filming in, and the production value, and the sort of throwing the money at the screen was a big part of the charm of that show. I don't know what you do to top that for cinema necessarily, but also we had a Breaking Bad movie coming out.
It's coming out.
I think only on Netflix, not in the cinema. We had the Deadwood movie, which was in the cinema, right?
No.
Was it not?
No,
okay.
Never went to cinema.
I thought it. Okay.
And I suppose so. There's lots to say about that. But so let's try and break it down. One of the things to comment on is the difference between having to go for a cinematic movie, as in it's going to be launched in the cinema, and having to go for what you would call a TV movie, as in it's feature length, but we're only expecting it to air on TV and have people. So kind of, renewing or keeping our TV audience. There is a different expectation there. So the X-Files movie, to go back in time, was shot between seasons 4 and 5 of the X-Files, but actually chronologically took place between seasons 5 and 6. And that put an immense stress on the production team, who are used to doing a TV show, not even used to doing a TV show, they are still doing a TV show. But, let's add to your plate, you're also going to do a feature film in the hiatus. So the TV show's off, and while a normal feature film might expect 4 to 6 months of pre-production, The X-Files had 6 weeks.
Wow.
To get it going. And this changes the dynamic. So TV has a pace. TV has, and we've said this, Generations as a film is a really good example of what happens when you change that pace and when you change that aesthetic and when you change that dynamic. And that's good. But with the X-Files movie, to take this kind of, I suppose, almost contemporary example for Star Trek, is what happens. Well, you know, we've got Mulder and Scully running around, and there's lots of big scenes. It's darker. It's certainly got a cinematic look, for sure. But then I would argue the X-Files TV series always had a cinematic look. You know? It was always shot incredibly well. It was always lit incredibly well. So what is the cinematic bringing to it? And I know that Chris Carter, the creator of the X-Files, wanted to end the series at Series 5 and then do a series of movies to kind of round it off. And Fox said no, because of course it was a huge moneymaker, and we know that because it did 9 seasons in the end, and then a somewhat lackluster later movie, which we shouldn't really talk about.
You know, not to get too into a digression about the X-Files, but I love that second movie.
Really?
I think that second movie is 10 times better than the first one.
Yeah.
And actually, I've only seen it twice. I saw it once in the cinema, and I loved it. And I saw it once when I rewatched the whole of the X-Files a couple of years ago. And again, I loved it. I thought it was brilliant. It was completely what I wanted from an X-Files movie in the way that the first one wasn't. But, you know, and it's almost like, I mean, people always say, oh, Insurrection feels like a TV movie, basically. Some people like that about it. Some people feel disappointed about it. I mean, I feel that's a bad thing, because I was only getting a Star Trek movie every few years. I kind of wanted a bit more than that. I love that second X-Files movie because it feels like a TV movie of the X-Files. Yeah. And it has a lot of the stuff that I loved about the X-Files. And that first one is just kind of a bit take it or leave it. You know, it feels like an action movie. It feels like a more generic movie to me.
I did it recently, again, talking about Megan and I rewatching Star Trek, while Megan and I also tackled the X-Files, and most recently the X-Files movie is what we did before then going back into the TV show quite recently, and it feels incredibly odd. You know, what is this film trying to achieve? And then actually by the time you get into the kind of sci-fi specifics, you know, the show had been hinting at this idea of alien colonization. The show had been going in this direction. And then by the time the movie took hold of it, you were watching a sort of bastardized version of Alien. What the hell is this? You know, we're giving birth. We're birthing aliens. Really? Really? We're going to go here? And you don't think you're being even slightly derivative of what I consider to be a sci-fi masterpiece? You know, but it's odd. Really odd. And then when it comes back in its 6th season, while me and you were discussing before that actually some of those episodes are some of their best are done in the 6th season, also they've got to deal with this weird we're birthing aliens plot. They've got to deal with it because they did it in the movie. But the movie was shot between seasons 4 and 5, and then it did season 5, and then they've got 6, and the whole thing feels quite messy.
And it's much more of a conundrum than, I mean, with Star Trek, it was a lot easier insofar as they knew they were going to crash the ship in Generations, so that's going to kind of bring an end. So I suppose that's the weird thing, is it's almost, because it's being, you know, it was written before All Good Things. I mean, and they've talked about this, Braga and more. They had a year. They worked for a year on Generations, and they worked for a month on All Good Things, and yet many people would say that they wrote a better script for All Good Things than they wrote for Generations, you know, in 12 times as long. But also, I suppose in some ways, there is that weird sense that Generations is the end of the Next Generation era, insofar as when they come back for the next film, everything, the look is different, the uniform's different, the ship's different, everything is kind of new again in some way. So they knew. But at the same time, they had a lot of freedom. They didn't have to slot it in that way. All they knew was that the starting point of it was basically the same as ever in Next Gen, and that meant that when they did end up writing the last episode of Next Gen, they had to go off into the sunset, and nothing, you know, it ends. You know, yes, it wraps up those 7 years, but at the same time, it's on to the next mission the next week. And we can imagine what happened in the, I don't know what it is meant to be like, less than a year, I think, between these two episodes, 6 months or something. But, you know, they had other adventures and other things happened, and, you know, who knows, read the novels, you know, comics, whatever, etc. But they did have that kind of, it's much less of a challenge, I think, that they were facing there. The X-Files was absolutely a head scratcher, and maybe played one way if you were going to the cinema and having this popcorn extravaganza and then going home and forgetting about it for a few months. If you go and you watch through like you're doing, and you watch the episode before the movie and then you watch the movie and then you watch the episode after the movie, it's a bit puzzling. It doesn't feel like
at all.
It doesn't fit quite as well. And I suppose that's one of the things, and one of the dangers with these movies as well, when they come in later, because often they come in after a series has fit, like a few years later, like the Deadwood one, I guess, is it's not the motion picture for Star Trek, but it's kind of, you know, it's a few years, and it's after people think that story is finished. And again, Breaking Bad, I think a lot of people were taken by surprise by that. They were like, we thought we were done with Breaking Bad. You know, I know we've got Better Call Saul and so on, but we were not expecting a Breaking Bad movie. And that is a real risk, I suppose, if you've closed the book on that story. Whereas with Next Gen, it was an intention, you know, it was planned. And really, the reason they stopped, it's not like Next Gen was cancelled. They stopped making the TV show in order to switch to making movies, if you know what I mean. They didn't have the idea that the X-Files had of doing them both and flipping back and forth. They were like, okay, we'll run this for one more year. That will give us time to prep the movie. Then we'll go into making movies every few years, and the Next Gen cast will do what the original series cast did. And they sort of had a model, I suppose, for what they were aiming for, you know, a movie every couple of years and so on, and a plan for that. But they did end up filming, you know, literally overlapping filming, you know, James Doohan, you know, the original series crew filming on one stage and the Next Gen crew filming next door, you know, wrapping up the TV show while they're starting work on the film, and managing to kind of do that transition. I suppose maybe what it comes down to, though, is I suppose we talked a bit about how the kind of hero's journey stuff with Picard maybe isn't always to the movie's strength, though I sort of feel like it sort of mostly works. I think most of the kind of more cinematic gestures the movie makes work quite well. Maybe with the X-Files, I don't hate that first movie, but like I don't think it's a brilliant either as a film or as an episode of the X-Files. It felt to me like it was pushing it in slightly broader, obvious, sort of crowd-pleasing directions that didn't quite work. Whereas I actually don't really feel that this movie, that Generations particularly, is doing that. I think the flaws in it are weird quirks of the way it's structured, and the kind of, it actually come out of the kind of quirkiness of it in some ways rather than the mainstream stuff of it. The kind of cinematic gestures are quite artistic and quite creative and quite effective, I think. But I guess one of the other things to think about is, you know, right now, I mean, we've had for years this divorce between CBS and Viacom, so Paramount and CBS being on kind of opposite sides. This distinction between TV Trek and movie Trek. So you've had the JJ films in the movie, you know, they had to sort of reinvent all of that. You've had with Discovery this idea, and all these kind of weird arguments about, you know, are they allowed to borrow design things, and this kind of fantasy about this 25% rule and so on, and all this kind of nonsense that's come out of this separation of these properties and the rules associated with them. Now, of course, they're back together. We could see a Pike movie. We could see, as people have been saying for years, why did we never get a DS9 movie?
Yeah, right.
You know, who knows? If there's enough interest there and Star Trek is on enough of a kind of high, we might start getting, whether they're TV, you know, Netflix movies, whether they're actual cinema movies, however it goes, there is sort of scope for Star Trek to start bridging that gap a little bit more. You know, for my money, say Pike, I don't really want to see a Pike. I loved Pike in Discovery Season 2. I thought he was great. I have no real interest in seeing a Pike TV series. A Pike movie, I would be a bit more like a one-off, probably a TV movie. There was the idea of them doing a mini-series on Khan, wasn't there? I don't know if that ever came to
that like seemed to disappear.
Different, being more playful with different kind of models of storytelling, whether that's, you know, a theatrical release movie, whether that's a kind of TV movie, whether that's a TV miniseries. It's kind of exciting, I suppose, the idea that Star Trek is now in a position where everything is all under one, you know, kind of corporate overlord.
Yes, that's right.
And therefore, there is the scope to in some ways be a little bit more experimental with those kind of things.
I mean, it's essential to remember, as you say, corporate overlord, but it's essential to remember that these stories only ever get told because someone somewhere thinks they're going to make money. It's sad to think that, but it's also the reality. Like, these are the only reasons that Star Trek ended up in the cinema in the first place was because of the success of Star Wars. Okay, well, if that can do it, we can certainly do it. The motion picture with mixed success and reception, and then Khan changing the format and doing, as you said, changing the direction of Kirk as a character and actually being able to stand alone in the cinema and justify its existence, I believe, until Star Trek V, when it became slightly problematic. But that's another podcast entirely. But what are the expectations of the executive and the studio when they're saying, okay, we want to make... So when we say different forms of storytelling, we've got to be quite precise, because if it's going to be a cinematic release, there are going to be certain expectations about what that is going to return to the studio and what that's going to return, you know. And again, you can see this. This is not blind. If you watch the Chaos on the Bridge Next Generation documentary, it's very clear. There are people here talking about $1 million deals, multi-million-dollar deals, indeed. We're not, you know, I like to focus on story and I like to focus on character. That's what I think it's all about. And indeed, I'll go on to that in just a second. But it is important to say that while these kind of big studios have come back together, which presents a new potential. I read an article the other day that said, oh, well, the new rival for Marvel is Star Trek. Right? Because suddenly we can do TV, we can do film, we can do it all together, we can make it all join up, we can make it all make sense together, and this kind of big meta narrative in a way that hasn't been done in...
We can have the crossover event of a generation.
Yes, we can, yes, and it won't...
And really find out.
Find out.
Who knows? William Shatner says he wants to come back.
He
Maybe
does,
we'll get the
for Tarantino's film.
So, you know.
And wouldn't that be... weirdly fantastic. I don't know how they would do it. There's part of me that would love it, and certainly a part of me that would go, what the are you doing here? Yeah. But I think what's more interesting to look at, other than the kind of financial motivations, is what are we doing with story and what are we doing with character? And I suppose where Generations falls flat is where Deadwood really worked. And Deadwood had a genuine 10-year, 12-year gap, actually,
right,
between the unexpected cancellation of their series and let's do a movie. And they talked about doing a movie straight away. We want to do a movie now. We want to close this series for all its fans. And it's very high-quality television. I think it's one of the best television series ever. And
you got that with Firefly, obviously.
Yes.
They did that. They got cancelled. They managed to make a movie pretty soon. Like within a couple of years.
Partly crowdfunded.
Right. Was it?
Yes. So that's an incredible, again, when I was talking about this with, I live with my brother, and so my wife and my brother, we're having this discussion, I'm going to do this podcast. They both said Firefly. And I actually said it doesn't quite do the same thing because it was only a one season wonder.
Yeah.
So we're not,
like
the legacy,
season, isn't it?
It's even it's a half season. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely adore it. This is not me critiquing it, but if you're talking about what Star Trek had to do, or what the X-Files had to do, or what Deadwood had to do, we're not in the same ballpark. We're just not. I again, doesn't change my respect for Firefly and Serenity, but it does mean we're talking about very different properties and very different franchises. And Deadwood, for me, was an exceptional TV show that I don't think closed on a note that meant I had to see more. But to hear they were going to come back and do more, that they had always wanted to. But again, it's financial, right? So why are we coming back? Why is Deadwood finally coming back? And the answer is because HBO is making Westworld, which meant they had a set for Deadwood.
Oh, right, okay.
It's all there. So Deadwood, the kind of 10 years later in the story of Deadwood, 10 years later town is the set of Westworld.
How weird. I didn't realise that.
No, but that's how they're able to financially justify it. Because you can't strike the set which was all built, and then come back
and rebuild it.
Well,
and Star Trek always had this. I mean, when they were ripping down the Enterprise D sets, they were repurposing them into Voyager. And
yes.
Some of those sets had come from the original series movies. They'd inherited bits and pieces. And I guess you've always had that. And maybe that's something. I mean, I don't know. I don't think at the moment, because we've got Discovery shooting in Canada and Picard shooting in California, I don't think so far there has been any of that kind of borrowing back and forth of kind of production, sort of value in that sense, or kind of, looking for ways to kind of share the costs or whatever. But maybe as more Star Trek, once they start doing this Section 31 show, although I think there's speculation that they will actually finish Discovery before that, potentially.
Yeah.
And then that will take the Discovery slot. But either way, there's scope there for them to share resources to some extent, to share sets and to kind of repurpose stuff and save money in those kind of ways.
There is. It was one of the biggest problems with the X-Files, though, is that the movie was shooting in LA and the show was based in Vancouver.
Yeah. And then they moved the show to LA, right, after that.
Did they really? Did they?
Yeah. I think from 6th season onwards, that's why it all suddenly looks a bit brighter.
And indeed, I was trying to work this out the other day, and I might be completely wrong, but I was watching an episode of season 6 and I thought, did they suddenly start shooting widescreen?
I think so.
That might be the moment, but
I'm not really the X-Files expert.
That's it, and nor am I. But let's so take us on our word.
Change the framing.
The framing. Well, yeah. I'll go back and look at that. But I think. Yes, there is this sharing of resources, and this is, in a way, Deadwood, and the way it finished for me doing the movie and coming back 10 years later. Now, interviewing the generations, it had a long-term producer and writer and director come on and do the movie. The same as the X-Files. Rob Bowman, who'd done several episodes of the X-Files, did their movie. David Carson did, So this is really important, I think, for continuity. But when you come to why do we need to come back to Deadwood 10 years later? So that's okay. Let's talk about that. Let's look at why we need to go back there. And the writers and producers in their interviews about it would say things like, well, actually, it's 10 years later, and what the movie is about is what time has done to these characters. Where are they 10 years later? What's happened to them in that time? What's happened to the town, because it was about Deadwood? What's happened to the town in that time? And Generations for me is very interesting in that regard, because exactly what we were saying, for the Next Generation cast, there is no time.
The fire in which they burn.
The fire in which they burn, there's no fire. Although, having said that,
so they start getting a bit more chubby as the movies go on.
As the movies go. But so we have this kind of there is no time. So it doesn't resonate the same way that the original series movies does, because it can't. And you can't pick apart Picard's character for getting older, mainly because he seems largely ageless, Patrick Stewart. But also you can't do it the same way you did Shatner's Kirk, because it isn't the same actual amount of time. When Deadwood came back as a movie, it had been 12 years for these actors. One of the reasons the movie didn't happen, budgetary sets aside, is all the actors were too busy. Ian McShane, Timothy Olyphant as the stars on various shows and movies, and they could never make their schedules meet. But Deadwood was a huge ensemble. So what were they all doing? They had no time to come back together and pull this movie. But then someone said, I've written a script, I'm going to do it, we've got the sets. And they managed to pull everyone except Titus Welliver, who is the only actor still alive,
right?
Who didn't come back, because he was too busy,
right?
Filming Bosch. I think this is
and of course, interestingly, you didn't get that with the Next Gen movies, but we are going to get that now. with Picard, aren't we? We're going to get that next year, and we are going to see an older, Patrick Stewart, who appears to be ageless at least for a long time, has finally aged.
Yes,
it had to happen eventually.
Yes,
and that fire has caught up with him to some extent, and he is now playing a sort of a different generation of character, I suppose. So we are going to get to see that storyline in a way that, that I don't know if it's in any way going to be similar to what we saw with Kirk and Co in the original series of movies, but we are going to see for Picard and also for Riker and Troy and anyone, and, I don't know about Data because it's slightly unclear in what sense Data is returning in this story, but certainly for those three and for 7 and 9, I suppose, we are going to see, and I've seen interviews with Jerry Ryan saying exactly the thing, what has 7 been doing in this intervening period, how has she changed as a person, all those characters, maybe not in the arguably slightly clunky way that it was done in All Good Things. Not to knock All Good Things, because I think it's a great story, and it's fair enough the way, it has to be done quite briefly there. But, that episode did think, okay, so what's Data like in 25 years' time? What are these characters going to be doing, and how are they going to... It did sort of try to answer how are their personalities going to have changed and so on. The Picard show is also going to be doing that, because he's not going to be exactly the same person that he was before, in the same way as Kirk in the movies is not the same guy as he was on the show. He's still it's still the same character, but life has changed them, time has changed them, And I suppose it's interesting that, ironically, although this supposedly is a film, Generations, a film all about time, you're right, it kind of exists in a bit of a temporal bubble. Not least because it was written out of, it was written in between season 6 and season 7 of Next Gen. So it actually, on one level, it is just a timeless episode. One of those episodes that could be shown in any order. It can't, obviously, because the ship crashes at the end, so it has to come at the end. But, it's very much not... There's not that opportunity to sort of say, even by the time of First Contact or something, you can kind of throw in a line or something about what they've been doing in the meantime. Do you know what I mean? That there's a sense of stuff going on. It is just the next episode after All Good Things.
Yeah. And but having said that, just to bring it back to maybe ways we can defend some of those creative choices in Generations, if Deadwood came back 12 years later in our time, 10 years later in the character's time, and the producers said that this show is about what time has done to our characters. Now, Generations could do that for Kirk, partly because it's been a very long time. Couldn't do it for Picard, but in a way, by killing off his family and by taking Picard into the Nexus to see what he didn't have, to present him with an alternative timeline, in a way it was addressing how these characters have been dealt with through time, and what time has wrought on these characters, and what time has wrought on Picard is simple. There's no family. I thought I had it. I thought it was going on elsewhere. I never made time for it. It's gone. Yeah. And so Malcolm McDowell's line, time is the fire in which we burn. Apparently he was so enamoured with that, it's engraved on that pocket watch.
Wow.
Yeah, genuinely. Yeah. It's from a poem. I can't remember the poet, but that's where it's taken from. But apparently McDowell was so taken with the line that pocket watch that Soren has in the film, it's engraved on that. Time is the fire in which we burn. And so in many ways, the film doesn't do what it should do, partly because, frankly, the audience hadn't missed them. We're looking for a sense of nostalgia that isn't there because the show has just finished and then I'm in the cinema watching them. Don't get me wrong, when I was 7 years old, that was fantastic. I'm not sorry that was happening. And the studio knew that. That's why they'd push a movie out straight away. But it wasn't the same as the guys who watched Kirk, and then he went off air in 1969, and then they waited 10 years, and in 1979 Kirk's back. And I don't, as we discussed, we did our episode on the motion picture as well, so I don't we have that is also a conflicting piece. By the time the Wrath of Khan comes around, okay, now we're talking.
Yeah.
Here's our guy. It's not him.
It's not our guy. Yeah, exactly.
But it is him. Time has taken its toll, and time is always supposed to take its toll on our characters. And so, yes, Picard coming up is all we could possibly hope for, I think, God, I'm optimistic about it. But, it really is. That's exactly what Generations kind of wanted to be, but couldn't be because the show had just ended. And that's a weird interplay, not one that I can quite quantify or one that you can definitely say is a thing. But it is a weird interplay between audience and the fictional worlds that they enjoy. You can't... The audience for Deadwood, I watched Deadwood pretty close to when it finished. So I think it wrapped in 2006 and maybe I finished watching it in 2008 or 9. So I've been waiting a very long time to see these characters come back. And I was absolutely floored by how they decided to do it and what had happened in that town since I'd been gone and they'd been gone. And you can't do that if you're running straight into a movie. You can't. So that's not Generations' fault as a story. And indeed, I think the story tries to make up for that by taking our characters, Kirk and Picard, to other times and places and giving that, it's something that you can't quite blame the film for. The film then does the best work it can possibly do without having been gone for 10 years. And that's the reality.
Without having that genuine nostalgia.
Yes.
And I think you're right, the film is sort of trying to manufacture nostalgia in some ways, particularly for both those captains, and maybe with Kirk it works. Maybe it's also, because Kirk has become a nostalgic character, and we see that in the kind of prologue to the film. We've seen it in all the original series films. Picard is not a nostalgic character, ostensibly, up until that point. And then we have to kind of buy this. And I know there's kind of, people who will say, well, this actually, if you go back and you watch Next Gen, you can see this progression, and there are episodes like The Inner Light that kind of change his character. And I do sort of buy that. I do buy that there's character development for Picard, but I suppose we don't. It is almost a bit like one of those things, like we find out about all this backstory when we need it, because it's going to suddenly... Do you know what I mean? We find out that he's been having these thoughts because suddenly they're brought to the forefront by the plot. That said, I personally feel the stuff about losing his nephew, losing his brother in the film, all of that stuff works really well. It's only really, I think, that kind of Dickensian family Christmas that slightly kills it. Because for me, and I do sort of wonder, does that play better in America? Do Americans think that because Picard, I know he's not English, but because we sort of accept Picard as coded as English, that's what English people... fantasize about. Do you know what I mean? Does that seem more believable across the pond? But I remember even at the cinema as a kid watching that and being like, what the hell is going on here? Is this really this incredibly rich, thoughtful, intelligent character? Is this sort of slightly cheesy, sort of Carlton Christmas card, Christmas TV movie land that we're in somehow? Is this really what his imagination is throwing up? Because it seems so cliched and it seems so kind of over the top and so embarrassing, really. That one scene. And that's the thing for me. And I don't think it ruins the whole film, but I do think it's a kind of iconic moment in the film, and quite a lot is riding on that moment. And it's unfortunate that for me is probably the worst scene, the worst realised scene in the film. In terms of the way that the production styles it all and sells it. Yeah,
because... Well, largely because it makes no sense. I mean, this is where are we? The 24th century? Christmas, if it still exists, isn't going to look like that.
It doesn't look like that now. It didn't look like that in 1995. Arguably, some people would argue it didn't even look like that in Dickens's time. It's a kind of
no, it didn't, because I believe my understanding of Dickens is that A Christmas Carol is the reason we celebrate Christmas in a certain way. Yeah. So no, Christmas never looked like that.
And obviously, it's Picard's fantasy. Okay, he can construct whatever fantasy he wants. But that is it's a weird insight into his psyche, and I don't think it's meant to be. That's what it feels like. It's a bit like, oh wow, you've been playing your cards close to your chest, Jean-Luc. You know,
That's
what
a lot
is this? This is what you fantasise about.
Yeah, that's a lot of...
Because we've seen him on the holodeck as Dixon Hill. And
Yeah,
so we know he does have this sort of fantasy life, but this is a kind of fantasy life that is unexpected. So
very unexpected, yeah, absolutely. The equivalent is him sort of warping into a parallel universe where it's all 70s porn mags, you know, and no one would expect
now, you know, Brannon
that.
Braga that was probably in the first draft.
No, it's there somewhere. You know, one of the either Braga or Moore had that idea and said, "Well, what if Picard? You know, what if Picard wanted to be a kind of 70s hunk?" And then they said, "Well, no, actually, I think he'd rather be a sort of Dickensian."
I think Patrick Stewart might have gone for that one.
Well, I think he would have.
It was all about the sex and shooting and everything. Yeah.
Would we?
Yeah.
Would we have preferred that version to the Dickensian?
Yeah.
You know, and I don't know. It's weird to just choose that time period, but I do agree with you. They're Americans writing it, and the audience is largely American.
Yeah.
You know, again, we could look at the box office figures, but I promise you that's where the most money was made, is a sort of American domestic box office. Would have done very well here, would have done very well internationally as well. But not as well. So is that their image of us? And similarly, that's why the only reason I can imagine Downton Abbey's bothered making a movie is that kind of vision of Britain exports remarkably well.
It does.
Far better than, as British people, we'd ever like to imagine it does.
Yeah. I wonder whether also, I mean, just as a slightly more serious point, one of the flaws maybe in the Nexus, and I think the film actually does address this, is that you sort of think, why is the fantasy for both these men what they didn't choose? You know, they both prioritised their career. They both prioritised this life in space, which Star Trek sells us as the big adventure, the most noble, the most exciting thing to do with your life. Okay, great. Sulu managed to have it. Or, you know, he's the guy. He's the guy who has it all. He has the family, and he keeps his job, and so on, and gets promoted. But that both these men have sacrificed the domestic life, and that they sort of yearn for the domestic life. And we do see that at other points as well. I mean, actually, Janeway, I always found it weird in that episode Workforce, which I mean, this is a whole other episode. You know, I can't stand that episode. And one of the things I don't like about it is it basically tries to sell us this idea that Janeway doesn't really want to be captain. She doesn't really want to have adventures. She just wants to live a sort of cozy domestic life, and she'd be much happier like that. And I just find that kind of hard to buy about any of these characters. And you sort of think, I was thinking, why is the Nexus not, if it's really giving them what they want, isn't what they want something a bit more? Isn't what Kirk wants to be back on his 5-year mission and to be young again and seducing all those alien women and having adventures every week and always coming out on top? And then the film does kind of answer that question, because the flaw in Kirk's fantasy is there's, you know, famously, risk is our business, and he realises there's no risk. He does that jump and it doesn't work. That it's just there's something hollow about it. It's just like a game. It's not real because there's no mortality. There is no threat of death. There is no danger. And that's the thing that's the flaw in the Nexus. I suppose like a dream, in a sense, in that a dream can kind of be scary, but you can't actually get hurt in your dreams. And maybe that kind of explains it. I think it does. It does sort of explain it again on paper, but at the same time, do we want to believe that these heroic characters, that what they really dream of is not being heroic, but retirement? When we've seen in the original series over and over again, Kirk hates retirement. And even the prologue to this film is all about how much Kirk hates retirement. And the one thing he wants is, you know, for the captain of the ship that he's on to leave the bridge so that he can take over. And yes, in the end, he kind of nobly says, all right, fine, no, you're the captain. I'll go and do the other thing that he's doing. But it's so clear that what he wants is, with what he ends up saying to Picard, he wants to be back on the bridge of that ship. Why does the Nexus fool him into thinking that really he wanted not to be a captain? Is that a flaw in the film? Because it is all about nostalgia, but it's about a nostalgia for something that these men never had and never wanted.
But it's not okay. Yes,
at the time, maybe they want it in retrospect.
No, it's a very tough question. On a character level, I absolutely agree with you, and then I'm forced to flip from character level to kind of audience level, and what I guess Moore and Braga were trying to do is create some kind of pathos with the audience, and the audience aren't on starships, and we're not roaming the galaxy, and the idea that our heroes might want something a bit more ordinary and a bit more normal is perhaps supposed to resonate with us, and we're supposed to sit there and go, oh, maybe I should look at, and that our careers, exciting as they may be, aren't hopping galaxies. They are, in fact, whatever they are, but maybe we should be looking, maybe it's meant to make us look at what we have and make us go, well, I need to check my priorities here. Because my hero, Captain Kirk, who once was trying to sleep with green women, doesn't actually want that. He wants something normal. He wants to be able to kind of cook eggs in the morning and ride his horse. And Picard doesn't want to go around lecturing the universe on how you should behave. Picard instead would rather kind of be at home with sort of strangely Victorian dressed children and a wife who pours Earl Grey. And maybe it's complicated, but maybe within all of that, we're supposed to, as an audience, take a view that all the fantasizing we do about what we definitely want actually then takes over from us looking around at what we do have and focusing on that. And that's very difficult. I can't speak for Brannon or more on that, at what they wanted from the screenplay and what they wanted us to believe. I can only say that it definitely resonated with me and has resonated with me for a period of time, despite what you note quite correctly. It's an incongruity. I'm not sure I believe that the Nexus is giving these characters what they want, but I do certainly believe that the Nexus, as written and as presented in that film, is giving the audience a taste of what they want. Or rather what they should indeed be focusing on, and probably aren't, because they're in the cinema watching Star Trek Generations. But
wasting their life
watching Star Trek.
So basically we're back to William Shatner's Get a Life, right?
That's right, yeah,
That's
totally,
yeah. Get a life,
get a life,
get a girlfriend,
go back out there, ride a horse.
Ride a horse.
What the hell are you
doing?
Get
a life, ride a horse.
Get a life, ride a horse.
Space nonsense.
Is that the title for this podcast?
Well, I suppose the other issue is, more. I mean, we both saw this film as kids. We enjoyed it a lot. We both talked about how as adults we go back to it and certain themes resonate that maybe didn't as kids. Of course, we're probably both older now than Moore and Braga were when they wrote this film, because they were very young working on Next Gen, weren't they? I mean, Braga was 25, I think, when he started on Next Gen, and this would only have been a couple of years later. So these are young guys writing about old guys. I mean, whether you want to say Patrick Stewart was an old guy, but
me and you are old.
Whatever. Kirk looks at him and says, "Are you approaching retirement?" And Picard's like, "Well, I hadn't really thought about that." But the fact is that is, I suppose, on the cards at some point. These are guys sort of past the prime of life, and yet the writers are both young. They were the kind of young whiz kids of Next Gen. Do you know what I mean? That they chose to write this film. They didn't get... I mean, Michael Piller turned it down because he didn't want to be... because they did this weird competition thing, and he thought it was demeaning, I think. Moore and Braga were up for it. They were up for the challenge. They were like, yeah, we'll give it a shot. We'll do our best thing. We'll bring in the Klingons. We'll bring in this. We'll do this here. And they won the pitch and got to make the film. But so I suppose there is that kind of interesting thing of, these are not older guys reflecting on life and reflecting on this stuff. These are young guys imagining what it's like for older guys to reflect on these kind of things. And who knows, maybe that kind of plays into it as well. But I think generally, I think this is an unfairly maligned film in many ways. I'd say clearly you do as well. And I think there's a lot to find in there. As I say, for my money, maybe it's less than the sum of its parts, but those parts are well worth engaging with, on their own terms. But before we go, Chris, do you want to let our listeners know where they can find you on social media if they want to carry on the conversation and tell you why they think Deanna Troi is the best character in Next Generation, or, why Picard's Nexus experience it makes total sense in terms of what we see of him in the Next Generation? How can they find you?
Yeah, I think they would be good discussions. You can find me on Twitter at nonetheless. That's NUNN, the less.
Fantastic. And thanks so much for joining us again on Primitive Culture. Well, it's been fun talking about Star Trek Generations, but that's not the only thing we've been talking about on Trek FM this week. So have a listen to what else you might have missed out on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, Earl Grey.
Okay, that's excellent. And it'll be interesting to see how we interpreted the topic, because I know I may have interpreted it maybe a little differently than others did. We'll see.
Is this another time travel thing?
No, I was going to say no time travel for me, as long as Jellicoe doesn't come into this.
Sure. Okay, so we'll make that deal then. Awesome. I'm in.
All right.
Literary Treks.
And, you know, the stakes are really big. You know, we'll get there, but, you know, this Borg ship threatens Earth and all this kind of stuff, and it just feels like it's a lot of really comic booky, over-the-top stuff that doesn't quite fit right with the novel that came before it and the novel that came after it, if that makes sense.
Primitive Culture. A look at history and culture through Star Trek.
And Next Gen arriving was this sort of, wow, this looks incredible. I know when we look at sort of first season Next Gen now, what we're going is, wow, this is really slow and stagey. But in fact, it was incredible. It was absolutely game-changing.
The Edge, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
Only because I was watching little bits of Emissary recently, is that he would see himself wearing that awful purple swimsuit and think, oh God, I can't wear that.
Oh my gosh.
Every time I see it, I'm like, whoa, I'm really glad I'm not wearing 24th century clothing.
If you wanted me to murder an entire society, fine. But I'm not wearing that bathing suit.
Too revealing.
That's where I draw the line.
That's funny.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they're published. And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Primitive Culture, and that will come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. If you'd like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you can find all our details at patreon.com/TrekFM. We'd like to take a moment now to thank our associate producers on Primitive Culture, Amy Nelson, Clara Cook, and Tony Black. Amy is a presenter of many other shows on the network, and you can find her on Twitter at Miss Amy Nelson. Clara and Tony were two of the former co-hosts of this show, and they'll be popping back from time to time. You can find Clara on Twitter at ClaraJeanMC, and Tony at AJ Black Writer.
You're blended all right.